Hello, everybody. Greetings and welcome to the opening panel of Blurring Borders.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Vanessa. Thank you.
It is a pleasure to bring you all here today. As I mentioned, we are bringing together leaders from the sectors of art, technology, and policy who have worked across these disciplinary boundaries. So today, we'll explore how we might overcome siloed thinking to shape artistic innovation and technological development for the benefit of all. So the way we'll start structuring things is by asking everyone to respond to the same question. I'll introduce each speaker and we'll go from there. So we'll begin first by discussing distinct different disciplinary values and potential gaps in knowledge and how we might bridge them, first in art and technology. To begin, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Veronika Liebel. Veronika Liebel is Director of European Cooperation, Organization, and Finance at Ars Electronica, where she works in programming and producing collaborative programs with partners from art, science, and industry, including the development of numerous EU projects such as the STARTS Prize and the European Artificial Intelligence Lab. Veronika, based on your own work and experience, what challenges have you encountered bridging the fields of art and technology? How have these challenges led you to understand what divergent values these different spaces have?
First, so thank you so much for having me in this fantastic, great festival this year. It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel. As maybe some of you know, Ars Electronica is an institution here from Linz, Austria, and we're working on this nexus of art, technology, society, and science since more than 40 years. So the key mission actually of Ars Electronica is bringing artists and technologists together. Because, of course, we actually want to ask the big questions of humankind, but also because the huge level of interconnection and interdependence on a global scale is something we want to investigate together. As all these technologies really rapidly change and grow even more and more complex, creativity and innovation, and that we are really convinced of, have become a key resource for societal and economic development. And not only has our interconnectedness brought us new forms of media, it has also significantly impacted the role of users who have gone from being mostly passive consumers to active producers, actors, and also influencers. And I think we all agree that arts has a word to say in this sector and in this nexus, and it also gains prominence as an efficient catalyst to convert science and technology knowledge into innovative product services and also processes, but at the same time also towards a humanist approach of the technology itself. And exactly here we want to bring artists into the game and thinking together solutions which address our social, ecological and economic challenges. There is a strong motivation for Ars Electronica out of several reasons why we engage in art and technology programs. One of this is definitely that artists have the potential of silo-breaking thinking. And one of the jurors in one of the last art and science jury meetings mentioned that he wants to bring in artists to Mercedes Daimler-Benz because they are really triggering completely new ideas within the science community. They don't want them to develop the specific car further. They really want completely new ideas, completely new ways of thinking, art thinking. Also, we know that in particular these art and technology programs like residency programs, for example, they are really agenda free. So they are open-ended practices. They have the ability of experimentation, and it is really something where artists and scientists can work together in a experimental way without a specific purpose at the beginning, at least. And for us as a culture producer, art and technology programs have also a huge relevance in producing new forms of cultural presentations. We really want to engage these collaborators, these artists, but also the scientists and technologists to think how we can transfer the topics then to the audiences, how we can engage them, how we can share this discussion they're leading within the process of the collaboration itself. of course, all this also comes with quite many challenges. And one of the popular ones, of course, are these misconceptions also of the work of each other. Maybe what researchers are doing the whole day is nothing what artists are usually experiencing, and they often do not have the sense or the idea at the beginning what infrastructure everyone is working with, and also in which circumstances and ecosystems everyone is working. So this is something you need to bring together, and there it is really important also to bring in really strong facilitators in the game, cultural organizations, but these facilitators can be really also from various disciplines. They're extremely important to build up also the mutual respect and eye-to-eye level relation, also to bring in everybody in the same boat. And of course, it is also often important to simply match the right people. It's at the end, it's a one-on-one relationship, or it's a personal relationship if cooperation between art and technology really turns out positive. So in our experience, at least, it is really important to find strong pairs between the speakers, between the collaborators. Those are the biggest challenges we see. From our point of view, it is not the case that the artists and the scientists work so differently or behave so differently. They're simply working in a completely different context. Artists are usually self-employed. They're working in a small context. They're also, of course, used to work on their own. And technologists and researchers usually have large infrastructure, not all the time, but of course it is mostly a different context, and those worlds is something we need to bring together. Those are the core points we did also as an evaluation within the last years in our work, and those are also the points we are working on within our residency programs at Ars Electronica.
Thank you, Veronica. Lots to chew on there. And I think that's a really great moment to introduce Joyce Grimm, who's also been working in a residency program, but in a tech and design firm. So Joyce Grimm is chief curator of Adobe's Festival of the Impossible, which reinvents the concept of an interactive exhibition. She's worn many other hats, serving as a contemporary gallery owner, a San Francisco City Arts employee working with the Mayor's Office of Economic Development, a professor at California College of the Arts, and a program designer for the Warhol Foundation, to name but a few. Joyce, you've got a lot of experience to bring to bear on these questions. What are your thoughts about what kinds of challenges you've encountered bridging fields and disciplines of art and technology, and how have these challenges led you to understand what divergent values these different spaces have?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here with all of you. Thank you. I think that the biggest challenges, I'm just going to jump in. The biggest challenges that I have noticed working with art and technology is really feeling like the curatorial role is more of fusing those two worlds and how to do that successfully. And I think a lot about the idea that we're in this world where people don't really have the attention span for information. And what's really struggling sometimes for me is being able to provide the proper context for each of the artist's works, and being able to give that to an audience so that they can understand or be exposed to something new, which means that some of the other problems are making sure that you truly understand your audience. Who is your audience? And being able to provide information for them to learn, to grow, to try something new, but also celebrate all the things that have come prior in the arts. Yeah, that's where I'd say the issues really are the hardest for me in my field now.
Great. Thank you, Joyce. I love what you said about audience, because I think this is a really crucial part of this conversation that I'd like for all of us to return to at some point. Because yes, we can have artists and technologists and policymakers, we can put them together, but who are we serving and how are we speaking to them? That's really important. Great, thank you. Let's return to that as a whole. And then these questions of art and technology, I think, have a real resonance when we're thinking about the connection to policy as well. So our next speaker is a distinguished scientist and technologist who also works in the arts and who's also had a great intervention to make in policy. Professor Linda Doyle is the VP of Research and the Dean of Research and Professor of Engineering and the Arts at Trinity College Dublin. She's an expert in the fields of wireless communications, cognitive radio, reconfigurable networks, spectrum management, and creative arts practices. Linda, a pleasure to have you here for today. Thank you for joining us. Same question for you. Based on your own experience, what challenges have you encountered bridging these fields and discourses of art and technology and to another degree policy, because I believe you've worked in this space? And how have these challenges led you to understand what distinct values these different spaces have?
So I think I'd answer that in two ways. So there's two parts to my answer, and I'd preface it by saying I'm actually working in an institution that's 428 years old. So that obviously colors your kind of some of the things I'm going to say. So if I were to summarize across those three areas, I mean, in principle, I think everyone working in those spaces can be creative and be creative in different ways. The way I like to think of it, oftentimes, I think of a bit of paper. And I always feel that if you give somebody with creative practice or arts background, they prefer to work from a blank piece of paper. An engineer or a technologist prefers to work within a set of constraints. And when I think of a policy person, I think of someone who's very focused on the words in a deeper way, maybe, than somebody who is in the technology side is. And they're very quite blanket statements, but for me, they kind of help somehow understand a little bit of the mindset of some people who work in those spaces. But I suppose the fundamental difference that I see and that I come across and work with, and it would be slightly, I suppose, different to what Clara said at the beginning when she introduced us. For me, there is no such thing as neutral design. So I think technologists often think that you're designing something that's neutral, that, you know, as Clara spoke about, that's a tool and can be used for good or bad. The art mindset and the art practice mindset and the policy mindset for me brings that question in, that no, the technology isn't neutral. There is some, I suppose, when you look at algorithms, when you look at hardware, there's something behind it very often that kind of, I think, has an intent that makes it not a neutral object in and of itself. So for me, they're the two things, kind of the side that believes there is such a thing as neutral design, and the side that I think questions that completely. So that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer for me, as I said earlier, is very influenced by the fact that I'm from an academic institution. And to me, I would say it's not about the differences in those disciplines or those areas that those disciplines and those people working in them see. It's the way the outside world values them. And I think what's a huge challenge is the lack of equality across those. So I see all of the time situations where technologists are rewarded financially very well, artists aren't, even if they're working in the same project. And that lack of equality, to me, is a huge issue. And the second thing I'd say in that context is this notion of epistemic injustice, where we value certain kinds of knowledge over other kinds of knowledge. And you see that very often. You know, I'm an engineer, and it's kind of automatically assumed that some of the knowledge I produce is more useful than some maybe aesthetic or creative artist practice knowledge. And I would completely contest that. But that to me is a difference, and not a difference from the people inside it, from where those things are viewed from the outside.
Thank you, Linda. I love that phrase, epistemic justice, because I think it really touches upon the way in which we divide and conquer, I guess, in terms of these disciplines. How you talk about how funding is dispersed is absolutely crucial. I mean, I've had conversations recently about here in the US, the minimum size of National Science Foundation grants being something like $2 million. But in the arts, we're really... there's a much smaller pool, and we're really working on trying to bridge that. But what are some ways we can really address that? So I think this also echoes part of what Joyce was saying about audience, right? How do we construct this kind of knowledge? How do we assign value in the public to this kind of knowledge? And how can we support different people in these knowledge building practices? Great, thank you. All right, I'd like to invite our next speaker to speak before returning to some of these themes in an overarching conversation. Ilana Lipset is a community design strategist whose work uses participatory design and community engagement to inform future-focused policy, economic and international development, and is currently working on these issues in her role at the Institute for the Future. So Ilana, you also have some experience working in art, technology, and policy. Based on your experience, what challenges have you encountered bridging these fields and discourses, and how have these challenges led you to understand what divergent values these spaces have?
Yeah, well, thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I'm loving what all the other panelists are saying as well. So thank you so much for having us all. I think the first thing that I want to just mention is that there definitely is a challenge and kind of divergent views, and as Joy said, different audiences that policy, tech, and art all serve. And I don't necessarily think they need to be bridged. I think that part of this tension is healthy for discourse and for conversation and for growing and pushing boundaries. So I don't think they necessarily need to be bridged. That said, there is tension in these different purposes that they serve, right? Policy, in theory, is supposed to serve the public interest and be effective across the board, whereas tech is looking for growth and serves investors and is focused on efficiency over serving everyone. And art has more of a leeway to kind of take risks and push boundaries and touch the emotional space. And those three things, the efficiency, effectiveness, and emotion, don't all necessarily work together in the same way. And so the challenge comes from, I think, that these different spaces, art, technology, and policy, are accountable to different people and different groups. And I think one thing that I've been thinking a lot about, especially the last 6 months, is kind of how do we start to think of, or how can we shift the narrative so that we see artists as essential workers, as an essential part of policy and our society, and in responding to the challenges that we have, in translating the challenges that we have from policy or science to things that people can understand and react to. And what does it look like to support them that way, with resources, with places to live, with safe places to work? And I think a specific example of this is in the Bay Area, with the cost of living so high, and with gentrification, not solely driven by tech, but in part driven by economic growth that is driven by technology. And what can policy do to kind of step in and be supportive of finding safe places for people to work and live, and affordable places for people to work and live, and really, again, start to treat artists as essential workers. There's an amazing Oakland-based curator and artist, Ashara Ekundaya, who talks about artists as first responders. And so I think really shifting our thinking around what role art plays in both policy and technology and society to help us think about what are we doing to help artists survive and to thrive. And the last thing I'll just mention in response to your question with this challenge is that I think that arguably tech, some components of tech, some big tech companies are really challenging our ability to have civil discourse and challenging our democracy. And I think art is a really vital component of healthy discourse and democracy. And so being able to really bring that to the forefront as a way of collaborating on how we create policy that can serve everyone, on collaborating on how we can create tech that can serve everyone, and have there be more of collective and participatory input into how we are imagining and reimagining the world and cities that we're living in, and how policy is supporting that.
Thank you, Ilana. Artists as first responders, I love that. And as essential workers, I mean, it's extraordinary how much artists are struggling and suffering right now. And in our isolation, how much art are we relying on to get by? How much music, how much film, how much is really kind of reflecting the pain and struggle of this moment. So what you're saying about how we understand artists, I mean, I'm really hearing an echo in what Linda's saying, and well as what Veronica and Joyce are saying. why are we siloing artists? Why don't we give them the support that they deserve? Why don't we reframe our understanding of how they are in the world and those kind of interactions between them? Absolutely, thank you. I'd love to return to all of that shortly. Before that, I'd like to introduce our final panelist, who has more experience working specifically in technology and policy. Evie Fuel is part of the delegation of the European Union to the United States. Evie works with the Minister Counselor for Digital Economy Policy to develop and facilitate key stakeholder engagement strategies in Washington, D.C. Thank you for being here today. So, Evie, based on your own work and experience in technology and policy, what challenges have you encountered bridging these fields and discourses, and how have they led you to understand what divergent values these different spaces have?
Thank you, Vanessa, and thanks so much to you and Clara for organizing this and to the grid. I think it's a really valuable and important discussion to be having. And thank you to all of the panelists here. I think it's a tough spot to go last, especially after all the great comments that have already been made. But I'm excited and encouraged to hear so much that I think resonates with me, particularly in terms of interconnectedness and the need for this kind of conversation. I think probably the easiest thing for me to talk about right off the bat to illustrate this sort of what Ilana called healthy tension between technology, policy, and art is actually the TikTok story. So, 2020 has been a difficult year in many ways, but I think that some would say that TikTok has been one of the greatest things that's happened. The artistic community has been able to connect and create fan bases. I think it's connected people who feel very alone at times. The TikTok challenges have been really fun for millennials and families alike, but I think it's a really great way for technology and a platform to provide artistic expression and to sort of connect people in that way. But it's a challenging story from where I sit in Washington, D.C. So TikTok is a subsidiary of ByteDance, which is headquartered in Beijing. And a lot of policymakers are concerned about data sharing practices for TikTok. So we see this clash, this conflict of values between policymakers, artists, and technologists in terms of what they value and how to use technology and how to make sure that these platforms are both safe and engaging and fun. So I think there are a lot of questions still to be asked about. I think it was Joyce who mentioned this concept of thinking about who we are serving. And I think that's really important, especially in the policy space. And I think that as companies like TikTok and other technology platforms gain popularity, it's important to consider things like data privacy and how can we make sure that is still protected for not just for consumers and from a consumer perspective, but for citizens globally. I think there's a real case to be had for finding a new social contract where artists, technologists, and policymakers can really collaborate and think about difficult questions like how to moderate speech on online platforms. TikTok has had trouble not only with data sharing practices, but with also how to make sure that they are eliminating or reducing or taking care of illegal content and harmful speech that is inciting violence. So these are issues that I see at the intersection of these three groups where interdisciplinary thinking could really help unlock some solutions to really difficult questions.
Thank you, Evie. It's true that these are pretty knotty questions, right? How are we going to be able to marshal these different roles that we have to address them? And I think the role of TikTok this year has been such an intriguing one, and it really, I think, opens up these questions about creativity and the role that they have to play in kind of democracy as well. All right, well, what I'd like to do now is kind of draw out some of the themes and questions that everyone's brought up in their opening remarks. So what I've heard from everybody here is that on one hand, we often think about artists and art as something extra, right? That's something that you get to do and you should be pleased to be able to do, but we never talk about these kind of thorny questions about what kind of support we need to offer artists in order to really allow them to participate fully in the questions around democracy, innovation, and interdisciplinary collaboration that we'd like to highlight. So Linda talked about this notion of epistemic justice. Why do we silo artists and engineers and policymakers differently? Why do we value their work differently? So in terms, it might take really redefining how we think about that. Ilana suggested that artists need to be thought of as first responders, as essential workers, which takes a particularly important moment in this time. So how then will we, and invite everyone here to sort of respond to this question and each other more broadly. What are some concrete what are some major challenges that you all see, having heard each other, that overlap? How do you see how do you see ways of supporting artists in the way that we need to? How do you see adjusting the kind of questions around value, and not just value in a kind of cultural capital, social capital sense, but in actually supporting artists with funds? How can we give them the same kind of status that we often give to other disciplines? Linda, would you like to go? You may want to unmute yourself.
Apologies. I've been on so many Zoom calls, thousands of them. You'd think I wouldn't do that anymore, but I keep doing it. I suppose I just make a general quick comment. Obviously, I come at this from an academic background, and for me, hugely important is that funding agencies would be much more expansive in their thinking and what they would fund from a research perspective. So while you see some programs in the European Union that do include these things, they're kind of added on to the end rather than there at the starting point. And I would say not just international funding, but national funding agencies, certainly in my area when it comes to research, need to include arts and humanities as well, as part of the whole picture, and not something that's just for certain situations. So that to me would be one very powerful way of changing things that would, I suppose, bring some equality into the picture, allow the voices to flourish, and to really influence the future of research.
Thank you, Linda. And I think this kind of support of this idea of how we can support artists also was borne out in comments that Joyce and Veronica were making about what it means to facilitate connection between artists. Veronica, you mentioned on one hand having an open-ended kind of encounter and staging an open-ended kind of encounter for collaboration, and yet also needing some kind of facilitation and structure. So on one hand, if like Linda's suggesting, we need these kinds of social and capital architectures to support that work. We also need infrastructure to do that. So how do we actually make structures that foster that kind of collaboration without privileging, having some kind of open-ended conversation without also privileging these one over the other?
I think this is an extremely difficult job, and we all probably know this also from our own practice in facilitating this, that the way of bringing these people together and also making it then in the process a meaningful process is really a extremely difficult task to do. But at the same time, it's also very important to, at the beginning, keep it open and to try to give people and the collaborators the chance to think completely in new dimensions and also in different ways, because otherwise it's more a design job or more a job of actually staying within the usual borders and lines of thinking. So again, as I said already at the beginning, for us, we really saw the value of having really strong facilitators who joined this process already in several years and who have the knowledge of bridging the different languages people may speak and also the different kinds of experience everybody is bringing in. But not only on this level, but also it's connected, of course, to IP issues. So how we can deal with everyone's IP everybody's bringing into the collaboration? How can we make sure that whatever is coming out there in the process is then also shared in a mutual way? Those are the things which actually need to be managed by a really strong facilitator. And we, of course, from Ars Electronica see also our role in doing this.
Joyce, do you have some thoughts about that, given your own work at Adobe, supporting artists using these kinds of new technologies and creating the space for artists to have that vision?
Yeah, so before I started becoming the curator for the Festival of the Impossible, I had my own gallery for years, for about 10 years. And I think one thing that I've always, maybe I learned this from my mom, but I think what's really important is the ethics of the person who's steering the ship. Really, like, there's a mission statement. It's having something that holds you and your ideas accountable, making sure that you've got diverse group of artists that you're bringing in, so we have different voices that are being heard, and being able to know that you can fight for those individuals. I've learned that, and I think that it's really helpful. Know when to put your foot down and say no, and be able to fight for the creative person who is building something really amazing. And that's not always easy, but I feel like that's a good way to start, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And this, I think, connects again, Ilana, to what you were saying about really redefining the role of artists and supporting them in that way. You mentioned, was it Ashara and her work here? Can you tell us a bit more about how you see her work doing that?
Well, to be honest, I'm not entirely intimately familiar with what she's doing. I know she has some interdisciplinary platforms, and you can find her work online. Her name's Ashara Ekundaya, and she is doing a lot of really amazing work with uplifting, just as Joyce was saying, uplifting voices of artists who have not been heard or who haven't been given a lot of platforms, particularly Black and Brown artists, and helping to redefine that, the role that they play in terms of what artists are able to create and what they're able to help us see as possible futures, and also how we kind of digest what's happening now. So I would encourage everyone to check out her work. And I would also just add, with a little bit of a historical context, the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's not an official U.S. government agency. It's a grassroots driven arts group that works on a lot of really amazing projects to involve artists in policy. And they have calls now for people to contribute to a People's WPA. So the WPA was the Works Progress Administration that FDR created in the Depression as a way of supporting artists and funding artists to do the work that they do best, and at once giving them employment and also bringing inspiration to the rest of the country, which was deep in a depression, and also funded the creation of hundreds of art spaces around the country. And so things like that, with this grassroots-driven arts organization, kind of trying to recreate these historical ways of government supporting artists and of acknowledging the role that artists play in society, I think is really important. And I think in our current political climate, we don't see any of that support really from the federal level. And so to be able to replicate it through other means, whether that's through private benefactors, things like tech companies who are supporting art and the role of art in society, or this grassroots-driven U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, kind of recreating the Works Progress Administration as a way of, again, redefining that narrative and emphasizing the role that artists do play in society.
Thank you, Ilana. Evie, I believe you had some thoughts that you wanted to share also about these questions.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa and Ilana. Just to piggyback off of your comments, I think that sounds like a fantastic program, a really good way to ensure that this interdisciplinary conversation happens. I was just going to bring up this thought of creating trustworthy AI. So I think this is a conversation that a lot of policymakers are having now, technologists and civil society organizations, is just how do you create artificial intelligence that does no harm? I think it's a very nice concept, and the words sound very nice, but what does that look like in practice? And I think for technologists, this could be about creating algorithms in a specific way, or an algorithmic framework that can kind of regulate and be transparent. And I think for HR managers or managers in general, it's conversations about what AI is and what it is not, what advanced machine learning is and how data is used, but making sure that there's a common understanding about, how the technology works. So it's not this creepy, invasive AI version from Terminator or other pop culture references that people often make. But the key question here is, what do the artists think? I think that's a piece that we could do more on, is how do artists perceive this concept of AI that does no harm? Does that mean, certain protections for intellectual property? Is that kind of a conversation about how artists can interact with AI-generated art, and what are the parameters there? So I don't have an answer, but I think it's a really interesting point that should be addressed in an interdisciplinary fashion.
Great. Thank you so much, Ivy. And I think that these questions about interdisciplinarity are a really great moment to pivot into talking about what some successful ways of really bridging those discourses are. So I'd invite our speakers now to discuss their successful approaches. So what are some examples of successful boundary crossing or interdisciplinary projects? And what are the kinds of structures that might foster that kind of boundary blurring work? How might different international contexts of the US and EU support them? Veronica, you've done a lot of work at Ars Electronica and STARTS doing exactly this. Would you like to tell us more about that?
Yes, absolutely. I'd be excited too. So I think it's a great opportunity also to introduce a couple of projects to really make sure that we maybe also be inspired by some work which was already done previously by fantastic artists. We're involved since many years now in the STARTS program of the European Commission, and basically it is a program honoring innovation at the nexus of science, technology, and the arts. It arose in a way, or it developed from evaluation from the past research program, where a good evaluation was made that in addition to scientific and technological skills, really creativity and also artistic thinking is needed to advance innovation and make also innovation really relevant for our society. And here I just brought a couple of examples. So please only understand them as examples, but I love these. Those are prize winners from the last years. We are issuing on behalf of the European Commission each year the STARTS Prize, and we are honoring each year 30 different projects and 2 grand prize winners of STARTS. And one project, maybe we can share the screen or bring on the slides again. But one project I really enjoy very much is the grand prize winner of last year, which is called Project Elias. And it shows in a fantastic way what also the role of such projects is in reflecting the use or abuse of technology and our relationship to technology. It is a small device. You can put it on your smart home assistant, and it paralyzes the device in a way that it wakes it only up when you want it to wake up. You assign it with a specific name, and only this will trigger actually waking it up. So it gives the consumer back the control over their home smart assistants, and it also helps, of course, with privacy issues and customization. And another project we have seen in the last years is a data collection and citizen science involvement program called Ciudad Vea Land Use Plan. So they did in a several years research project. They brought in the government, they brought in also economic parties from the city center of Barcelona, of course citizens, to discuss really the coexistence of the economic part of Barcelona, but also of the citizens itself. And they collected data, they visualized the data, they tried to understand through a big data process also what are the qualitative data and quantitative data they need together. Of course, this would be all existing in Airbnb and other big corporations, but they turned the wheel and they involved the citizens. They tried to gather the data from the citizens directly and analyze them together and make really also propositions for the use of the city center of Barcelona. Another example, I think, of how the STARTS Prize is also facilitating art thinking and humanizing technology is a collaboration we have seen a couple of years ago from the Kunsthochschule Weißensee in Berlin. Otto Bock is a big prosthetics company manufacturing, and also FabLab Berlin, and they work together for developing new ways of prosthetics, and in particular also how these prosthetics can interact in a more natural way with natural body parts. And I think this is also a quite clever way of, on the one hand, trying to innovate the technology itself, but on the other hand, also bringing always this relationship between the human and technology into the center of interaction. One last example is this year's STARTS Prize winner, Andrea Ling, and the project called Design by Decay, Decay by Design. And she is actually not reinventing recycling, but she is using biotechnology as the key to design waste firsthand. And this is a quite clever move, because then it is a completely new way also of organizing the decay and decomposition. So how to make the waste material, especially also plastic waste in this case, a product which is gradually decomposing and not beginning with the thinking only at the level of recycling, but really starting already from the material process itself. Those are just a couple of examples, but we are really excited about those examples, and they also are, of course, presented in Europe through Ars Electronica, but also very many other organizations in a way that they serve policy. They try to also extract the learnings from these projects and serve it to further programs.
Thank you, Veronica. These are amazing projects. I'm really excited to see what's been happening here. And it seems like the infrastructure that you've been building at Ars Electronica is really supporting this in really exciting ways. And yeah, really excited to see how the STARTS Prize is shaking out. I'd like to invite too, then, I know, Linda, that you've been working on similar kinds of interdisciplinary spaces also in Europe. So perhaps you might discuss some of what you've been doing in this space and how you've been working to bridge and boundary cross in the same way.
I'd love to. I have to say, Veronica, they were very impressive projects as well, and Ars Electronica is just such an amazing organization. So maybe I'm speaking at a smaller scale here. So as an engineer, I used to run a research center for telecommunications networks, communications called Connect. I'm not leading that anymore, but Connect is alive and well. And mainly that organization was very, very much about doing research with engineers, physicists, computer scientists, etc. So part of the way I kind of cope with crossing the boundaries is by creating strategies and groupings that can exist within traditional groupings and challenge those. So we have a group here in Trinity called OMG. It stands for Orthogonal Methods Group, and it kind of suggests that they work in an orthogonal fashion to the engineers. But it picks up some of the comments that were made earlier about attention. And what I see that group is made up of artists, designers, creative practitioners, writers, visual artists, a whole mix. But what I see that group doing as kind of creating a tension between the technology and the research that's emerging within Connect and society, and understanding that tension. And I suppose providing a kind of vocabulary for artists, designers and engineers, computer scientists to come together and deal with those issues. And for me, the key thing there is when I look at the research group, I look at the Connect Centre, we have a whole load of tools we use to do the research. You have your typical mathematical tools, your simulation tools, and your computer science tools. And for me, creative arts practice is another one of those tools, another way that you interrogate, technology, the world around you, and question what I mentioned before, the idea that things aren't designed in a neutral fashion, and understand what that means. So for me, it's really, really important that artists exist right in the middle of technology research and engage completely on a day-to-day basis with that if we want to change the world.
Thank you, Linda. Yeah, I think what you're saying about how technologies are not neutral is absolutely central and essential to this discussion. How on one hand can we foster ways of thinking that recognize that? Because it's clear to me, but it's easy to see technologies, particularly well-designed ones, as being neutral, right? Like the better designed they are, the more they're invisible.
Yeah, I mean, I have to, it's a big, huge bugbear I have, and people may agree or disagree with me. I mean, there's traditional examples that people have always talked about, the whole idea that the Kodak film was designed for white skin, the fact even electronic cameras that we have now are, have certain, I suppose, characteristics. And it's hugely visible in the algorithmic world. So, there's social policies built into the world around us. And they're built in intentionally and unintentionally. And I think essentially, I often use the phrase, and for people here who maybe come from a technology background, they may be used to this notion of optimizing something. And when you optimize something, whether it's a chip or whether it's an algorithm, you have this thing called an objective function, and you optimize to this function. And I often use the phrase, the objective function is not objective, it's political. It's a choice as to whether you optimize something for speed, or whether you optimize something to be the cheapest, or whether you optimize something to include and exclude. So that's what I mean when I say, design is not neutral. I think very much when you're trained as an engineer, you're trained as if it is, and as if these choices don't sit in a political context. And for me, everything sits in a political context. And one of the most brilliant things about artists is I think they're trained to see the political context. That's your starting point. And that's why I think it's just so hugely valuable and brilliant to bring these worlds together, because there's nothing that's wrong with this world today that we can tackle from a single discipline anymore. So I think it's just so important. Sorry, I kind of ranted on a little bit there.
No, rant away. This is the place for that. Ilana, you had some thoughts too, or you wanted to share about these questions.
Yes, and well, I completely agree with what other people have been saying about tech is not neutral. It's based on the objectives and worldview of the people who created it. And I think the same can go for policy. And so I think something that's important is for us to step back and understand kind of what our default design is, and who are we designing for, and who are we kind of using as the baseline norm, both in tech as well as in policy. And someone mentioned the Kodak film that I read recently about a Black medical student in the UK who created his own kind of medical clinical diagnosis textbook, because he was realizing that what he was learning, the way that medical conditions present, they were learning how to diagnose them on white skin. And so they were misdiagnosing or underdiagnosing the way that disease can present on Black and brown skin. And so kind of rethinking who our default is, and who our norm is, and who we want to, who are we creating the future for? And I think that artists are really particularly well equipped at helping us rethink and redefine what that norm is and kind of who the future gets to be for, who gets to be living in the future. And I think an interesting kind of border crossing or border blurring concept is the use of artists in residencies in government programs. And I know there's a number of states in the US who have artists in residences in their departments of transportation. Oakland has a pilot cultural strategists in residence program that's pairing artists in departments like the Department of Building and Inspection, or also Department of Transportation or Department of Racial Equity. And the idea is not just for the artists to be creating art, but to actually be bringing a different mindset and a different perspective for solving these massive public problems. And part of that, and part of one of the ways that we solve these really kind of sticky and wicked problems is by bringing more perspectives and more backgrounds to the table. And by bringing in artists, and in particular bringing in diverse artists, we can help redefine that kind of baseline and default.
Perfect. Thank you. That's really diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think, are what some of the most urgent questions and opportunities of our time.
I wanted to say one.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Joyce.
I wanted to add on to that because you're right. I mean, this is amazing to hear all you guys. It's really, really special. I feel like it's a really nice group to be a part of. One thing I just want to remind everyone too is that through the critique process of art making, artists are constantly asking questions. And that's why, exactly like you're saying, bringing an artist in for a residency program or understanding public policy, we're trained to ask questions. And that's what makes this process, the art process, so fundamentally sound. And we need to make sure that we fight to keep that, because it is what opens doors. So just a nod to art education in general and like larger concept thinking. I think I just support that, and so just wanted to add that in there.
Great. Thank you, Joyce. Absolutely. I mean, I think it really highlights an ongoing theme of our discussion, which is, sure, let's bring artists in, let's bring them into the conversation, let's support them. But how can we do that without instrumentalizing them, or turning art thinking into a tool in service of something else? How do we honor and preserve what is really special and unique and important about art thinking? Evie, you had some thoughts you also wanted to share about these questions.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. I think a lot of great points have been made already. I think something that I think is key is really bringing these policy discussions to the public, to the people, and realizing that diversity is actually essential to great policy making. I think it's something we know we need more of in every field, but I think it's crucial for the policy making sphere as well. And that's diversity that includes members of the artistic community. So I love what Ilana's talking about of this artist in residence program at federal agencies and government agencies. I think having that different perspective can really strengthen the policymaking process. And when we talk about things like artificial intelligence, I think we need to think about how that serves humanity and how that can be a tool to further innovation and further ingenuity, further the artistic community. I think about how artists are sometimes on the fringe of conversations, and they represent maybe less popular views or opinions, and that's so essential to public discourse and to public debate. I think one important topic that policymakers are looking at right now is how to make sure that freedom of speech can be preserved on online platforms, and artists who may be somewhat marginalized, or maybe they represent a smaller segment of society, can still be heard, and they can still have their designs and ideas kind of pushing society forward, questioning the status quo. And for policymakers, it's a real question of how do you make sure that you can ensure free speech, but balancing that with making it a safe space for all users. I think the European Union's Code of Conduct is a really great example of how civic organizations, platforms, and government can come together and tackle things like hate speech online and make sure that bigger technology platforms can still be representative and still offer artists and the general public a way to express themselves and be heard, but to do so in a safe environment that protects fundamental rights. And I think going back to the conversation on AI, privacy is a fundamental human right in Europe. It's protected, and I think that that's something we need to have more conversations about globally. How do we protect privacy for individuals so that technology is not just benefiting the consumer, it's benefiting the citizen.
Vanessa, can I make a comment there as well?
Go ahead.
I think it's really good. You asked how do we not instrumentalize artists, and I think for me there's two answers. You pay them properly, so equality stops people being instrumentalized, and tech companies should stop fake using artists would be another thing I would say. So, there's companies who kind of have various different artists in residency programs, and, it's about the spectacle or kind of making their products look, a particular way. And I think deep and proper engagement is distinct in any of that kind of what I would call very superficial way. Those two things would be a start.
Yes, absolutely. Returning to these questions about justice once again. And how can we support that? I mean, this seems like something we want to address at the policy layer, but also at the social layer. How do we pay artists more? I mean, I think this is something that is endemic to industries and spaces that are often understood as particularly meaningful. So you get paid in meaning. That's great, right? It's almost something that you can eat. And so that's something that I think we really need to address. And it's something that happens in all levels of conversations. People are saying to someone, "Oh, can you do this little bit of free art for me?" Whether it's something like, "Oh, if you love it, you should just do it because you love it." But that's not enough, right? Linda, I think your point also, this question about what we can do, turns us as well to these other questions we've been addressing about marginalized artists. So someone in our audience has asked, how do you include more marginalized artists with varying points of view that are not generally invited to the table? I mean, we're talking about it, and this is part of these bigger questions about diversity and inclusion, and I think it connects to, Linda, with what you're saying about the kinds of structures and concrete actions we need to take. So how would you suggest that we do that?
Oh, just answering.
Linda?
From an academic point of view, we're about to undergo what we call an inclusive curriculum review. And I mean, it might seem, I think we're from different countries here, and there's probably very different perspectives, but it's long overdue that we kind of do an overhaul and look through what it is we teach, what context we set up for people to learn through. And I think actions like that are really valuable across all disciplines and subjects, but they do actually start to make you think more broadly in the kind of material you incorporate into what you do. And I think that's one way. I'm answering that much more generally than specifically for artists. But I think a lot of things that are happening in the world at the moment are raising those questions for all institutions and asking us, who do we include and exclude? So actually taking those questions seriously, reflecting on yourself and changing your practices within the institution that you're in, or the company that you're in, or the organization that you're in, I think is an important first step in doing that.
Absolutely. I've seen an extraordinary response recently from artists of color who are suddenly getting far more attention than they ever have. They're being invited to speak on panels, invited to serve as advisors. And is this moment going to be sustained? And as Linda, as you see, what are the practices at an institutional level that we can leverage to make sure it's not just a fad in keeping with our political moment? What can we do to sort of sustain and include artists? I think, for one, that it's really important to address a lack of equity and inclusion at all levels of an organization, right? The people in leadership, not just artists, the people who are making decisions, advisory boards, all of these things. And the other I think another thorny question then, because a number of these panels and talks that I've seen artists have to deal with are ultimately like, oh, well, let's talk about this particular issue relating to diversity or to inclusion, as if marginalized artists can only talk about the condition of being marginalized. How can we address that differently?
I think that's a hugely important point. We had a recent discussion here about research and disability, and the thought struck me as well as we have some amazing researchers here who have disabilities and are doing research on that topic. But I agree, I had the exact same thing. That should not be you should be equally entitled to research any other topic you want. As well. So I agree with you completely that we have certain expectation that you will continue to either make art or talk about marginalization, and we need to move beyond it. I think we can just move beyond it by running more events that are not based on that and doing the kind of things you're doing here.
I would also add that I think that we, in our positions, we need to diversify what it is that we're doing, what we're involved in. And I think that means like having different types of exhibition, not always working for the same money funder, for example. Having other opportunities to dig in and meet other artists and meet other people and build other projects. I think that's really fundamental too. And it's not always easy, especially here in the Bay Area where cost is so incredibly high to live. It was much easier as a 22-year-old, but it is a reality. If we can have our hands in many pots, we have a better understanding of how the world works. But we have to be able to make choices so that we can live, but also we can do that too. That would be what I would say.
Ilana, you had some thoughts to share on this matter?
Yeah, I think, absolutely agree with the other panelists. And I think there's also an importance in creating open platforms for artists. And to the audience member who was asking about including marginalized artists with different points of view, I think sometimes it's not even necessarily about opening up a seat at the table. It's bringing a table to them or going and seeing where they're sitting, and creating open platforms that allow people to contribute and allow people to contribute different points of view, different types of art, different ways of working, and compensating them for it. And I'm always hesitant to kind of talk about what type of regulations or policy we might want to encourage that. But I think given the way that our society is working and is functioning, there are ways that you can, let's say if a government is commissioning public art, or if in a number of cities in the US, private developers need to put a certain percentage of their building budgets towards public art. And so if there are ways to kind of codify that you want to only work with local artists or only work with artists of color, or that you'll prioritize those over others, I think that can be a way to kind of start to equalize what has been an unequal playing field for people who've had the resources to either work for free or have the resources to be able to apply for grants, because not everybody knows that grants exist or know how to apply for grants or speak the language that the grants are offered in. And so kind of opening that up and offering a wider platform that people can step onto and offer their work and offer their art and be compensated for it, I think is one way to start to address that.
Excellent. Evie?
Yeah, just jumping in on those points, I think it's super important. I mean, I think there's never been more need for this diversity, but I think that that's also crucial when we start the process. So at the level of creating the technology, I think it's crucial that we have a diverse workforce there, that there's diversity in the technologists, and I think that furthers the ability to have diverse products that serve all people all throughout the value chain, all throughout the supply chain, and through all different use types. I think, Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression book is a really great starting point for looking at the need for diversity in creating technology. But when we look at the policy perspective, I appreciate Ilana's comments. I think it's so true. I think we need to look at how we ensure this diversity through regulatory decisions and policymaking. Something that I think that the United States can look more to is Europe's actions on antitrust. I think, there's some movement on the Hill now. There's some movement in the U.S. Congress in looking at the consolidation of power in a few technology platforms. And I think it's important to think about how we can enable small businesses to thrive, how we can enable diverse perspectives, diverse ways of thinking about delivering information online in particular, and maybe that's looking into more antitrust actions. I know that the European Commission is doing a lot of work to think thoughtfully about how to ensure robust competition amongst different technology platforms, because I think that plays a role as well.
Great, thank you, Evie. And I think that starts to address a follow-up question in the comments, which is how do you approach sustaining the integration of disadvantaged artists? And it's about learning from other frameworks, be that the EU and these kinds of policy frameworks that you're talking about, and ensuring that there are consistent practices along the way. And I'd invite any of you also to respond to this question. What are some ways that we can sustain this integration and not just have it be of this moment?
We think you asked us too hard a question. I do kind of think there's no going back from this moment.
Mm-hmm.
I think the world is in such a perilous place. I have to say, I think the US is particularly, and I just think there isn't a way to wind back if you look at the climate change situation, if you look at COVID, it has really questioned everything we know about the world around us. It's a fantastic example as well of how you had to have all sorts of different disciplines and skills and experts come together to solve things. So for me, I think there isn't a going back. I can no longer myself look at things now without questioning them in a particular way because of all of the things that have happened in the last few months. So I would be hopeful that there is no going back from this political moment. I think there's an awful hard work to hold where we are. I'm not, denying that. But anyway, that's just a general comment.
Great. Thank you, Linda. Ilana, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think, and we've touched upon this, but I think it does come back to funding. And this, with the unemployment stimulus package, or whatever we want to call it, for COVID, artists were able to apply for unemployment for, I think, the first time. And so kind of rethinking the ability that, rethinking the public services that we do have and how artists might be able to access them, even if they didn't have a traditional employer or have other kind of ways of working. And I think especially as we move into the future and just the nature of work in general is changing, and we're seeing the rise of the gig economy and automation and all these different, and now working from home. And so I think if we can start to acknowledge and honor the work that artists do as their work and compensate them as such, and whether that's funding for them directly or funding for art support services that help artists and allow them to survive and thrive in this environment, I think it's really important. But again, comes down to funding and, not asking people to share their art because they love it or because it will give them exposure, but actually compensating for the time that they have put into honing their craft.
And just to piggyback on that idea of funding, I think there are two potentially creative ways that policymaking could get involved in this conversation. And one is what Ilana just mentioned about gig workers. I think that there's a possibility that lots of artists are working, 2, maybe 3 jobs just to pay the bills or however they're trying to get by. And I think there should be real consideration from policymakers in how gig workers or platform economy workers are treated. Are they treated as independent contractors that have no benefits, no medical insurance or anything to support them, or can we treat them differently? Should there be regulations and laws that make sure that tech companies, which are getting a rather large profit are actually treating employees correctly in this new wave of the economy. And then secondly, thinking about, how these large technology companies are taxed. Are they taxed fairly based on the earnings that they're making and their contributions to the economy? I think that's a real question, is can we use proper and fair taxation to create more of a social safety net for more people?
Good point, Evie. I absolutely agree. Seems like a unique challenge, particularly in the US. I'm not as sure about the European context, but it's a difficult one here. All right, we are entering the last few minutes of our panel. So I just wanted to close, extend a general question, an invitation to everyone moving forward, which is, what do you think? I mean, we've talked about a number of these questions: diversity, equity, inclusion, freedom, climate change, COVID. What do you think the most urgent needs are that we should address at this intersection of art, technology, and policy? And what might be some quick recommendations you have for moving forward? Oh, I can't hear you, Joyce.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say I can give it a stab. I don't know if I have a large answer, multifaceted question there, but I think honestly, looking at each, I think the only thing really that we can do is think about how we, in our position, can make a difference. Can we help with policy? Can we get more money for the artists? Can we support better? Can we diversify the artists that we're bringing into this platform? I think all of us need to be able to ask ourselves that question when the roles that we play. I love all the points that everyone is bringing up, and it makes you feel like the reality is like, here we are by ourselves in this little space, So when we're going out into the world and building these art projects, what kind of difference can you yourself make and influence other people to also make really good choices too? That would be my answer.
Thank you, Joyce. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Ilana?
Yeah, I'll go. And to kind of bring it back to something that was named at the beginning, I think in addressing all of those massive issues that you named, I think it's important to remember that none of these are neutral. Art is not neutral. Policy is not neutral. Technology is not neutral. It's based on the view of the person who's creating it. And so, echoing what Joy said, bringing in diversity, bringing in representation, having people from different backgrounds and different viewpoints represented at every single level of the development of technology, art, policy, how we talk about it, who gets to be on stage, who gets to talk about it, I think is one of the biggest things that we can do right now to start shifting the conversation so that we are hearing from people who haven't been heard from in the past.
Absolutely. And that's work I think we can all continue doing. All right. Sorry, Linda?
The urgent thing we can do is, I mean, even in this discussion, I think, and I'm guilty of this myself, we kind of separated art out as a different thing. And if you notice, we focused on the art more than the tech and the even though Evie, you were very good at dragging us back into policy so brilliantly. But to me, it's about setting, it's kind of what Joyce was saying, in all of our actions and all of our words, giving it the equal status. And when we look at the problems the world faces, recognizing, speaking in that way, and making sure that we think of these as parts of the solution to the. I mean, art in itself doesn't have to have a utility. I'm not suggesting that, but I certainly think it's really, really important that we speak and act. I suppose the fact that it is of equal value. What does that mean? But speak and act the value that we see in these worlds coming together, working with each other and working in tension with each other. Because I mean, if the tension goes out of it, I think then that would be really bad, because we do need it, especially in the world we live in today. We constantly need the critic and the questioning that tension to be used.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda. And I think that is a fantastic moment to bring everything to a close. Thank you all so much for making the time to be here this morning. Obviously, this conversation can and should keep going, and I invite you all to continue it with me as we go off stage. So thank you again, and please take care, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Exposure.
Thank you, and great
Ciao,
job.
thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.